Let me start with something you probably learned from your mother, which is that you can have too much of a good thing. In fact, when you're making decisions, recognizing what's good is usually the easy part, and deciding when to stop is usually the hard part. Should I have dinner tonight? I know the answer to that is yes. Do I need a third helping? That's the hard question. This same principle applies to social problems. Do we need a fire department? I'm going to say the answer to that is yes. Do we need a bigger fire department? I don't know. The mere fact that something is good doesn't mean that you need more of it. There's a right amount. Likewise, the mere fact that something's bad doesn't mean you need less of it. Take pollution, for example. We can all agree that pollution is a bad thing. That doesn't mean we want to live in a world with zero pollution, because a world with zero pollution would be a world without a lot of the other things that we all enjoy. Certainly I wouldn't have been able to travel here from the United States in a world with zero pollution. So there is some right amount of pollution. There's such a thing as too much and such a thing as too little, an amount where people would be happier if we had more, or people would be happier if we had less. And once you've recognized that, then the interesting question becomes, does the world today have too much pollution or too little? Once you've recognized the right amount's not zero, it becomes possible that we've got either too little or too much. And you can't tell just by looking. You can't tell just by looking at how much we've got whether that's too much or too little. But I think I know the answer. I'm pretty sure the world has too much pollution. And the reason I believe that is because, by and large, the people who decide to undertake activities that cause pollution don't have to live with all the consequences of those actions. Somebody starts a factory that belches forth smoke into the air, and other people are going to have to breathe that smoke. And there's a general principle in economics. I'm going to state this in a very casual way, but we can make this very formal and precise, and we can prove it, that when people don't have to live with all the consequences of their actions, they tend to make decisions that are in a precise sense, socially wrong. They do too much of the stuff that imposes costs on other people. They do too little of the stuff that imposes benefits on other people. That's why we have too few people out there in the park picking up trash. Because if you go out there in the park and pick up trash, most of the benefits are going to be felt by other people, not by you, and so you don't have the right incentives to go out there and pick up enough trash. Okay. Nobody finds any of that surprising usually when I tell them that. Of course, we can differ about what the policy implications are, but nobody generally finds that analysis surprising. What I want to do is take that same simple principle that we can all agree on and apply it to a few other social problems and see where it leads us. Let's first take the question, does the world have too much or too little casual sex? Now, for starters, let's do a thought experiment. Let's suppose that you are a very promiscuous, reckless person who's at least more likely than average to be infected with something terrible. And when I say, suppose you are this promiscuous, reckless person, I want to make it clear that's a generic you. I'm not looking at anybody in particular. Suppose you are this promiscuous, reckless person with a history of a lot of partners and careless behavior. You are more likely than average to be infected with something. Well, if you go out tonight looking for a partner, you are, in effect, polluting the pool in which everybody else is fishing for partners. You're making the world a more dangerous place. The analysis is exactly the same as it is in the case of pollution. You're imposing costs on other people, not all of which you feel yourself, and therefore you engage in too much of this activity. You have too many partners. Okay? And that's, in some sense, a bad thing. Okay? Well, nobody ever seems to find that surprising either. But let's look at the flip side of it. Suppose instead that you are a very careful, cautious person, and you know, although the rest of the world doesn't know, you know that you are much less likely than average to be infected with something. Well then, when you jump into that partner pool, you unpollute it. You make it safer for everybody else. The person who goes home with you tonight is going to be having safer sex than they realize. And that's a benefit that you have conferred on other people that you don't get the full benefit of. It doesn't fall on you, it falls on somebody else. And that suggests that just like the person picking up trash in the park, you're not doing enough of that activity. The world would be a better place if you took more partners. Now, not too many, because we don't want to turn you into that dangerous, promiscuous person we talked about before, but the world would be a better, there's such a thing as too much, okay? But the expectation is that your current choice is too little. In fact, if you are that cautious, safe person who typically has very few partners, if the reason you're safe is that you very rarely take a new partner, then when you do take a new partner, you make the world safer in two ways. There's the way I just told you about, right? It improves everybody else's chances of going home with someone safe. But there's another way you make the world better, which is empirically a lot more significant, although also a little more macabre. And that is that if you go out tonight and take a new partner, you might hook up with somebody infected. In which case, you might get sick. In which case, there's a very good chance you're going to go home and you're going to die, which is terrific. Because when you die, the virus dies with you. And if somebody's going to get infected tonight, I want it to be you and not my friend Promiscuous Pete, who's going to spread it to 20 other people before he dies. Okay? I want the people who rarely take new partners. That's who I want out there getting infected. Now, unfortunately, you can't turn this into a practical pickup line. You can't go into a bar and say, think how terrific it would be if you came home with me and I infected you with something and you died. And the reason that doesn't work, of course, is precisely the whole point. It's the disconnect between what's good for the individual and what's good for the society. There's a gap there between what's good for the individual and what's good for society. Just like you can't say to the polluter, you shouldn't pollute because think how good it would be for the rest of the world if the air were cleaner. He doesn't care about the rest of the world. And likewise, this cautious person is making the selfish decision to have fewer partners than the rest of us would like him or her to have. What does that imply for policy? Well, that depends, I guess, where on the political spectrum you are. The way we deal with pollution, sometimes in the United States, sometimes I'm sure here, is that we impose mandates on polluters. We tell the car makers what sort of fuel efficiency they have to have, or we tell people how to run their businesses. We tell them what kind of smoke detectors to install. The analog of that in this case, I guess, would be telling people how many sexual partners to take. We would order the promiscuous people to have fewer, and we would order the less promiscuous people to have more. If you don't like that kind of government mandate, what many economists prefer for dealing with the pollution problem is a system of taxes and or subsidies to nudge people toward behaving better. Now there are all kinds of, I'm sure there are people in the room who are going to cringe at that too. We can talk about that later. But if you believe in taxing polluters and subsidizing cleanup efforts, then by the exact same logic, you want to tax promiscuous people for taking new partners, and you want to subsidize cautious people for taking new partners. There ought to be a reward from the government if you can prove that you're a cautious person who took a new partner last night. Now, a problem with implementing that is that we can't tell by looking we can tell by looking who the polluters are, but we can't tell by looking who are the cautious people and who are the promiscuous people, who are the reckless people, who are the safe people. The way economists usually want to deal with that kind of problem is by devising a reward that only the people you want to subsidize will value. Okay. So in this case, for example, you might say that the reward for taking a new sexual partner is a library card, which the very promiscuous people presumably have very little use for. Or, less frivolously, you might want the reward to be free condoms, because contrary to what you might expect, condoms are most valuable to the least promiscuous people. And the reason for that is that the more promiscuous you are, the more likely you are to already be infected. The more likely you are to already be infected, the less value the condom has. The condom is most valuable when you know you're not infected yet. Those are the people who have something to protect. So the subsidized condoms, the free condoms, encourage sexual activity by precisely the kind of people we would like to encourage it by. Unfortunately, it's not a big incentive. A condom is pretty cheap to begin with, but in principle, that's something that ought to work. You know, a lot of people say that as far as the spread of disease goes, condoms have an upside and a downside. The upside is that they directly protect against disease, and the downside is that they encourage more sexual activity. Well, I'm saying that's not an upside and a downside. That's two upsides. They directly protect against disease, and they also encourage sexual activity by precisely the sort of people whose activity slows down the spread of the virus. Okay? Now, by how much? And so let me make a point here, a slightly subtler theoretical point. What does economic theory tell us? What do we have to learn by observation? Economic theory tells us that because the cautious people making decisions don't feel all the benefits of their actions, they must be taking too few partners. What that means is that if they took more partners, we would all somehow be happier. Exactly how would we be happier? The theory doesn't tell us that. One possibility is that we would actually slow down the spread of disease. Another possibility, you see there are two forces here. If I'm a safe person, I go out and take another partner, there are some ways in which that slows down the spread of disease. There are also ways in which it could increase the spread of disease because every sexual act has a chance of transmitting something. So another way in which it could make the world better off is that we would increase the amount of disease, but we would also increase the amount of sexual activity. People would be having so much fun, it would be worth it to them to take this additional chance of disease. Okay? That's another possibility. Theory tells us that one of those things has to happen. Again, you can write this all down with equations and proofs and mathematics, but theory tells us that one of those two things has to happen. If the cautious people move up their activity a little, one of two things: either we slow down the spread of disease, or we speed up the spread of disease, but at the same time, it's worth it for all the extra fun people are having. Which of those two things happens? To answer that, you need a more detailed theoretical analysis, and you also need to look at a lot of real-world numbers. And you need to know not just a lot of economics, but also a lot of epidemiology. Well, fortunately, there's a guy at Harvard named Michael Kramer who does know a lot of economics and a lot of epidemiology and is very good at working with numbers like this. His estimate is that in Great Britain, if we took everybody who currently averages fewer than 2.25 partners per year, moved them all up to 2.25 partners per year, not past that, but up to 2.25 partners per year, you would substantially slow down the spread of HIV. You would substantially slow it down. I should mention too, before leaving this topic, I want to go on to some other topics, some other applications of the same principle. It's important to notice that the whole problem here is caused by the fact that we have private information, that our sexual histories are not visible to other people. If your sexual history were completely visible, if you wore it on a billboard, then you would be rewarded for all your past caution because it would make you more attractive to new partners. You'd get rewards for it. The problem would go away. The whole problem is when you don't get rewarded for the past caution, and the reason you don't is that people don't know about it. Possibly technology will deal with that problem someday. Possibly someday you'll have a monitor embedded on your thigh that says this site has been accessed 357 times. But short of that, the private information is the source of the problem there. Okay, let's take another issue where people ask whether we have too much or too little of something. I'll move from the topic of sex to the closely related topic of reproduction and ask, does the world have too many or too few people? Is the world over or underpopulated? Now, when people attempt to address that question, there's always someone in the crowd who says, well, look, there's a limit to the number of people the earth can support. That's true, okay? But that's not a serious person. Because we all know that there's a limit to the number of people the Earth can support. That's not the interesting question. The interesting question is, do we currently have too many people or too few people? The fact that there is such a thing as too much has nothing to do with the question of whether we currently have too much. So how do you decide whether the world has too many or too few people? What economic theory tells you is the only way to settle that question, is to look at the incentives that are faced by the decision makers, whether there were costs and benefits that those decision makers were not feeling when they made their decisions. In this case, who are the relevant decision makers? They're the parents and the potential parents who are deciding whether to have another child or not. So let's look at the cost-benefit analysis that goes into having another child. Okay. And here's what, if I had slides, I would at this point have up here a chart with 2 columns and 2 rows. A column for costs and a column for benefits. And a row for the private costs and benefits, the ones that the parents feel themselves, and a separate row for the costs and benefits that spill over on other people. It's the costs and benefits that spill over on other people that are the ones that are relevant to the social question here. The costs and benefits that the decision makers feel themselves are nobody else's business, right? They can weigh those costs and benefits themselves. So let's look at the cost-benefit analysis of having another child. Let's first look at the costs and benefits the parents do account for. The big benefit, of course, is you expect to love your children, you expect them to love you, you expect to have all sorts of wonderful interactions with them over the course of their lives. There's the big benefit. That's why we have kids. On the cost side, you got to feed them, you got to clothe them, you got to pay for their schools, you got to bail them out of jail, and you got late nights staying up with them when they're sick. Parents weigh those costs against those benefits. They feel those costs, they feel those benefits. If they decide to have another kid on that basis, so far we have no reason for anybody to second guess them. Now let's look at the costs and benefits that spill over on other people, and let me start on the benefit side. First of all, and most of you have probably discovered this by now, at some point in your life, somebody other than your parents is going to be glad you're around. Somebody is likely to love you at some point, even if you're, a crazy libertarian. Somebody is likely to love you. You're going to have friends. You're going to have people who appreciate your company. Those are benefits that you bring to the rest of the world that your parents presumably did not account for when they were deciding to bring you into this world. Beyond that, you increase the world's stock of diversity. You increase the world's stock of diversity not just by being that unique individual that you are, by having those unique points of view and those specific interests that other people can benefit from sharing in, but by creating critical masses, by contributing to critical masses so that the world can support chamber music or parasailing or Ethiopian restaurants or other activities that or for goodness sake, the Adam Smith Institute, which most people have no interest in. I mean, here we are in a city. How many million people are there in this city? We got 65 of them here tonight. If the city were half as big, we couldn't support a meeting like this. And so just by being here, you help to make those things possible. But bigger than all of that, far bigger than all of that, as you go through life, you have ideas, big and small. And those ideas enrich the lives of others because other people get to steal those ideas. And they get to not just steal them, but improve on them. And your ideas live forever. They live, well, some of them, of course, are very localized. Sometimes your idea is, hey, let's put on a show. But other times your idea is, hey, I wonder if we can build computer chips out of silicon. And one idea like that is, of course, a world-changing idea. It transforms the world, and not just for your generation, but for generations to come, and not just by itself, but because it inspires other ideas. The history of the last 200 years has been one of just absolutely phenomenal material progress. That was the other topic I thought about going for tonight, was the incredible material progress of the last couple hundred years. It's just almost unfathomable, and it all is driven by ideas. I had a historian tell me recently that the reason the Industrial Revolution happened when it did was because of the spread of the cultural notion that whatever you did all week, it was worth taking a couple hours now and then to think about how to do it better. And the ideas that came out of that transformed the world. And of course, when we think about ideas transforming the world, we all think about technology. We think about the cotton gin, we think about the sewing machine. More recently, we think about those silicon chips. But it's more than that. It's also the farmer who thinks of a new method of crop rotation. It's also the businessman who thinks of a new method of inventory control. And these ideas, not only do they inspire new ideas, but they interact and they make each other more productive. The reason you have a personal computer on your desk is partly because somebody said, hey, I wonder if we can make computer chips out of silicon. But it's also partly because somebody else said, hey, I wonder if we can finance startup companies with junk bonds. And neither of those ideas would have been terribly valuable without the other. In fact, if you want to know which is more important, which of those ideas was more important in driving the computer revolution, a good, very rough way of estimating that is to follow the money. And if you do that and you go back to the 1980s when personal computers were first starting to take over the world, you find that Microsoft's annual profits were about $600 million a year. The annual income of Michael Milken, the junk bond king, was about $600 million a year. So on that basis, it looks like roughly a tie. You can fly to Tokyo, partly because somebody figured out how to build an airplane, partly because somebody else figured out how to insure it. Ideas interact like that. So the ideas you bring to the world are a tremendous benefit to the rest of the world, which your parents did not account for when they were deciding whether to have you or not. So those are big spillover benefits. That's like picking up trash in the park. Those are reasons to think your parents didn't have enough kids. Of course, to make this a fair analysis, now we have to look at spillover costs. So what are the spillover costs of bringing a child into the world? A lot of people immediately, when they hear that question, they latch on to resource consumption. They say, oh, well, think of all the space you take up, think of all the food you eat, think of all the fuel you consume. But I'm not convinced that that's mostly spillover costs. Here's why. Let's think about where you get those resources. Some of them you produce. You grow an apple tree and you pick an apple that nobody else would have, the apple wouldn't have been there if you hadn't been around. That's not a cost. You're not imposing a cost on anyone. Some stuff you trade for. You grow that apple and you trade it for a fish. Well, there's no cost there. We've got a mutually beneficial exchange. Everybody's better off. And another big source of resources for many people, and I suspect disproportionately for the people in this room, another big source of the resources that you get is you get them from your parents. You get them from the day you're born in the form of parental attention, in the form of schooling, in the form of their making sacrifices in order to instill values in you. Later on, you get financial help from them, and many people get big inheritances from their parents. Okay? Those are resources that you get to consume that the rest of the world doesn't get to consume, but where do they come from? Who do they come from? They don't come from me. They come from your brothers and sisters. That's who would have gotten that stuff if you hadn't. And here's the important point. Your parents, in most cases, cared about those brothers and sisters and still thought you were worth it. In other words, they were weighing those costs in the decision. They don't count as spillover costs, right? If the cost falls on the decision maker, then it's not relevant to the social problem. Or to put this another way, look, if you've got an older brother, the day you were born was the worst day of that older brother's life. You cut the parental attention in half. I think we have two brothers in the front row here. You cut the parental attention in half. You cut the inheritance in half. You cut everything else in half. But your parents who cared about that older brother still thought you were worth it. Which means that the benefits that you bring to your own family are already enough to compensate for all those resources you took from your brother. Okay? There's no reason for the rest of us to worry about that. You know, a lot of people get this wrong. A lot of people imagine that if I weren't here, there'd be a little bit more for everybody else. And that's not true. What's true is that if I weren't here, both of my sisters would be a whole lot richer. Okay? You guys would be exactly where you are. So that resource consumption, insofar as it's felt inside the family, insofar as it's felt by the decision makers, is not relevant to the social problem. Okay? We know that those costs, big as they are compensated for by benefits, otherwise the parents wouldn't have chosen to have that kid. Okay? And if you're sitting there thinking, well, what about all the children that the parents didn't choose to have, the children that just sort of happened, I'll address that in question time. I don't believe there are very many of those kids. If we're going to look for spillover costs, then, of bringing a child into the world, we got to look elsewhere. Where are those spillover costs? Well, some children become thieves. That imposes spillover costs. Some become conquerors or join armies that forcibly take things away from other people. That's a spillover cost of bringing a kid into the world. Some of them become major polluters. Some of them draw very heavily on public assistance, and that's certainly a cost that falls on other people. So insofar as kids, there's some probability with each kid that they're going to become a thief or a major polluter or a warrior. That's a legitimate spillover cost that we'd want to put into this cost-benefit analysis. I have not done any kind of careful numerical analysis on this, but my strong expectation is that if you did, you would find that stuff is swamped by the positive benefits of the ideas and the diversity and the love that the average child brings into the world. After all, most of us are not thieves, most of us are not major polluters, most of us are not warriors. Those other benefits are so enormous that my guess is that the spillover benefits of having a child are bigger than the spillover costs, and if that's true, it suggests that people are not having enough kids. It suggests that the current world population is too small. Let me just, at the risk of belaboring what I hope I hope I've made my point clear by now, but at the risk of belaboring it, let me give one other example. Suppose we got two families, and each family lives on an acre of land. And this family here, they double their size every generation. So a generation from now, everybody's living on half an acre of land, and then a quarter, and then an eighth, and then a 16th. And a few generations down the line, they're all living on these tiny little pieces of land, and they're not very rich. This other family there, they practice zero population growth. And 10 generations down the line, they've still got an acre per person, and they're much richer. That's not a social problem. That's an opportunity to celebrate diversity. We've got a family that preferred to have a lot of kids, and a different family that preferred to have rich kids. That's a choice. There's a lot of joy in having grandchildren. Okay? And these guys decided to have one kind of pleasure in life by having a lot of descendants. These decided to have another kind of pleasure by preserving their assets, their per capita assets. Okay? There's no social problem there unless they somehow interact. Okay? Now, first of all, this is tangential to my main point, but I can't resist mentioning it. Those two families are already helping each other a lot, because the guys with a lot of capital are increasing the value of these guys' labor, and these guys, via providing a lot of labor, are increasing the value of these guys' capital. These people are producing, they're building machines and factories and so on, which are far more valuable because of the big labor pool over here. And these people are looking for jobs, and they're finding much better jobs because of all the capital that's been accumulated over here. So they're already benefiting from each other in that way. But that aside, unless there's some other interaction between them, there's no reason for one family to try to influence the decisions of the other family. Now, of course, if the very big family decides that they would like to have some of that capital for themselves, and if they form an army to go steal some of that capital, then the family on the right has reason to be concerned about that. But in the other direction, The family with 10,000 grandchildren is going to produce 10,000 times as many ideas as the family with one grandchild. And and everybody can steal those ideas, so that's a reason to wish they had more. It's all a question of separating the private costs and benefits from the social costs and benefits. I have one child, a girl. She's 25, she just got engaged. She just got engaged to a terrific guy. I am so glad that his parents did not practice zero population growth. And the reason I have one child is because I decided that was how many children I wanted, given the costs and benefits. I made a perfectly selfish decision. But somewhere in the world, maybe even somewhere in this room, there's a woman about my daughter's age whose life has been permanently impoverished by my failure to have a son who would someday sweep her off her feet. And if I had cared as much about that woman as I care about my own daughter, I would have had that son. I was not thinking about the full social consequences of my decision not to have that second child. I made the selfish decision. I understand that. I understand selfishness, okay? We're all selfish all the time. I can't criticize that. But what does strike me as a little strange is trying to encourage other people to be selfish, which is exactly the purpose of organizations like Zero Population Growth. I can't leave this without saying a couple words about overcrowding. Whenever population comes up, people always say, well, what about the problem of overcrowding? And the answer that's just a ludicrous argument, because overcrowding is completely voluntary. The world is basically empty. There's lots of places you can move to if you don't like crowds. Why are you in London? You're in London because you got chamber music, right? And Ethiopian restaurants and the Adam Smith Institute and better jobs. Okay? Why are those things here? They're here because of the crowds. If you don't think that trade-off is worth it, you don't have to live here. I've traveled around the north of England. I've seen a lot of empty space up there. You go to Calcutta and the crowds it's unbelievable what the crowds are like. But people are moving into Calcutta, not out, because they'd rather be in the crowded places. Those who differ from that, those who have a different preference, they got plenty of places to go. You know, it seems like there are a lot of people in the world. It seems like there are a lot of people in the world. The fact is, they all fit in the Grand Canyon if you stack them right. Or, if you prefer a different image, here's one I got from Thomas Sowell. Take the state of Texas, one of the 50 American states, admittedly one of the bigger ones, but one of the 50 American states, divide it into housing lots of 5,000 square feet each, which is a reasonable size to put a house on. Put a family of 4 in each of those houses, and you have just housed the entire world's population. But we lose track of that because, of course, it's easy. I mean, there's always somebody around to notice a crowd. There's nobody around to notice an empty place. So that's why we're so aware of the crowds. That's the same reason why your estimate of how crowded your doctor's waiting room is probably a gross overestimate, because chances are you're there at the most crowded times. I know that because most people are there at the most crowded times. That's what makes them crowded. Most people are there at the most crowded times, and so the average person's estimate is much too high. The same thing comes up. It's an important point, actually, in this is again a tangent, but in economics research, you go around asking people, how long have you been unemployed? Most of the people you're going to find who are unemployed at any given moment are the people who are unemployed longer than average. If you're surveying at a given moment, the people who are unemployed at that moment are typically going to be people who are long-term unemployed. The short-term unemployed probably got jobs before you got around to asking them. So you tend to overestimate those things. And not just that, but psychologically, I think crowds call our attention to themselves, and so we overestimate how big they are. It's something in our psyches when you're stuck in traffic on a hot summer night. It's very easy to remember that the guy in front of you is imposing a cost. Somehow we forget that the guy who invented car air conditioning is imposing a benefit. and that if you reduced the world population, you'd be as likely to get rid of one of them as the other. I feel like I should close by drawing a moral, and I have a small moral, a medium moral, and a big moral. The small moral is that there are good reasons for thinking the world is underpopulated. What the policy implications of that are, I'm not sure. Standard economics tells me that, well, if we're getting too little of something, we're getting too little of something because people are not feeling the full benefits of it, then we ought to subsidize it. Economic theory tells me we should subsidize it, but of course that economic theory assumes that the subsidies will be doled out by wise and beneficent people, and I think that's not always a terribly good assumption. But at least orthodox economic theory tells me that we should be subsidizing population growth. At the very least, it suggests that we should not be taxing it or discouraging it. Now, I do want to stress there, I have not proved that the world is underpopulated. I've given you a framework for thinking about it, and the reasons why I believe that if you did this carefully, it would come out the way I think it would, but I don't know that for sure. So my small moral is that the world is probably underpopulated, and that we should not be discouraging population growth. The medium moral is that whenever you face a question about whether the world has too much or too little of something, whenever you face a question about whether the world has too much or too little of something, the only productive way to address that question is to think about who are the decision makers, what incentives were they facing, what were the costs that spilled over on other people, what were the benefits that spilled over on other people. And to approach a question like that without thinking about the incentive structure is I don't know of any case where that's a productive way of thinking about that kind of question. And my big moral is that pursuing logic wherever it leads you is both fun and enlightening. And sometimes it leads us to conclusions we didn't expect, which is fine, because if it always led us to conclusions we expected, there'd be no point in it. Sometimes you get surprises. Sometimes the results are not what you expected, and that's fine. The big moral is that logic is useful, and it's often a whole lot more useful than its rival, common sense. Common sense is what tells me the earth is flat. So I'm going to stop there and take questions.